Have you ever thought about how many times you've lived by rules you never chose? How many times have you held a desire in your chest, as if it were a bomb about to explode, just to maintain the image the world expected of you? It's like signing an invisible contract with silence, a contract that seems to protect but actually imprisons. I, now 65, know exactly the weight of this pact. For decades, I maintained the life everyone wanted to see, the upright, serious, respected man, dedicated to his work, always discreet, always trustworthy. But behind this persona was a man full of desires, needs, and wants that didn't fit the narrow mold society imposed. And perhaps you, watching, also know that tightness in your chest, that feeling that you lived more to meet expectations than to hear your own voice. I grew up in a time when being different wasn't an option. I learned early on that words could become weapons, that curious glances could turn into judgments, that any misstep could forever tarnish my reputation. I wasn't naive. I understood social codes. So I did what many did. I donned the mask of seriousness and built my life around it. I became an exemplary worker, a polite neighbor, a discreet man. No one questioned my stance, and that's how I survived. But surviving isn't the same as living, and that's where the wound begins. Every silence kept steals a piece of the soul. Every repressed gesture creates an invisible scar that time doesn't erase. The strangest thing is that I never sought to experience overwhelming passion at first. There was no room for it. What I found were arrangements, hidden encounters, situations that felt more like contracts than love stories. Men who claimed to be heterosexual but sought me out in the dark of night. Men who had families, wives, children, but who showed up at my door when the weight of the lie was already unbearable. For some, it was just a quick lust. For others, it was a way to alleviate loneliness. For me, each encounter was a mixture of pleasure and guilt, of joy and emptiness. Because deep down, I knew none of this could blossom in the light of day. How many men watching this video have experienced something similar? How many have been secretly sought out but never publicly acknowledged? How many have wondered if they were truly desired or just used as an escape valve? If this has happened to you, leave a comment. Contract. Because this is the invisible thread that binds so many lives. Contracts of silence, of convenience, of survival. Contracts that no one signs with pen and paper but which dictate entire destinies. I carried a duality in my gaze, the glow of someone who knew hidden intimacies, and the weight of someone who was never truly chosen. And this stayed with me throughout my adult life. I worked in big companies, earned respect, and gained recognition, but I always returned home alone. The silent apartment was proof that my contract with the world had a price. The walls held memories of bodies that passed without leaving a mark, of voices that whispered promises that would never be fulfilled. I knew I wasn't alone. There was an entire generation living this way, men who, like me, had to learn to divide themselves between what they wanted and what was allowed. And it's at this point that my story begins to stand out. Because, contrary to what many would expect, I didn't experience just one great forbidden love. I experienced various forms of desire, disguised as need. Among them, one of the most intense was with Sergio, a married man, a family man, who sought me out not for love, but for financial survival. Sergio needed money. He needed support. He needed someone to sustain part of his charade. And I, in the silence of the night, accepted this role, believing that perhaps there was affection there too. But there was a very fine line separating desire, need, and exploitation. A line that sooner or later would break. The most intriguing thing is how natural it all seemed. Sergio would say unashamedly, "I love my wife, but I need you." And those words were like a double-edged sword in my heart. On one hand, I had the attention and touch I so craved. On the other, I was constantly reminded that I would never be the first choice. I was the secret, the refuge, the hiding place, never the assumed love. And perhaps you, who follow this story, know how cruel this position is, knowing that affection exists, but an affection that comes loaded with guilt, limits, and lies. If you've ever experienced this, leave a comment. Limit. Because that's exactly what it is. Invisible limits that prevent love from becoming freedom. Little by little, I began to realize that this invisible contract I signed early in life was unfolding into smaller, almost imperceptible contracts. With each man who sought me out, with each silence I accepted, with each excuse I made, and it consumed me. It wasn't just my body that was aging, it was my soul that was becoming heavy, burdened with secrets that could never be told. Neighbors saw me as a man of impeccable routine. Relatives saw me as an example of discipline. But no one imagined that, behind the closed gate, there lay an entire life made up of forbidden encounters, of unspoken loves, of stories that could only be lived in the dark. And perhaps this is the most painful point. The world didn't allow me to love my way. I had to settle for fragments, for leftovers, for stolen moments. And, this wasn't just my choice, it was the only way to survive in a society that always watched me, always judged me, always forced me to be someone I wasn't. The question that remains is, how long can I sustain a life like this? How long can I carry the weight of so many invisible contracts? This is the wound that paves the way for what's yet to come, because I believed I could continue living in this division forever. But life always finds a way to exact its toll. I'd never realized how a bond could begin slowly and, without realizing it, turn into a prison. Sergio entered my life as if asking for nothing more than a favor, a small loan, a coffee, a ride to work. Then, an informal invitation, a meeting at a discreet bar, always with the same line, "It's just between us." At first I believed it was nothing more than occasional encounters, a passing arrangement. But the weeks turned into months, and I soon realized I was increasingly entangled in a routine that was not only one of desire, but also of dependence. Sergio had a wife, children, and a life to support. And I, alone, with my savings saved from years of hard work, ended up becoming part of the invisible foundation that kept that family afloat. It was strange, almost cruel, but also irresistible. When Sergio arrived, always with a pained look and a rehearsed speech, I felt a mixture of anger and tenderness. Anger because I knew I was being used. Tenderness because at the same time, there was affection in his gestures. There was real desire in his touch. Sergio never said, "I love you." He never promised the future, never spoke of plans together. But in each encounter, there was an intensity that confounded me. My body responded, my heart raced, and for a few hours, I forgot the weight of loneliness. And that was what kept me trapped. The illusion that, even as a secret, I could still experience what I called love. The hardest part was dealing with the absences. I'd go days without news, messages, or phone calls. When Sergio finally showed up, he always came with excuses. "The family demands a lot. I can't arouse suspicion. You know how complicated it is." And I accepted it, even though I knew that in practice I wasn't a priority. I was the refuge, the escape, the hiding place. How many of you have experienced this? Have you ever felt like someone only comes when they need you, but you still open the door? If so, leave a comment below. Prison. Because that's exactly how you feel. Trapped in a cycle that hurts but at the same time, nourishes. Our encounters were always marked by contrasts, sometimes intense, bodies intertwined, gazes that seemed to break the silence of decades. Other times cold, quick, almost mechanical. I never knew what to expect. And this unpredictability was addictive. I told myself I should cut ties, that I needed to set boundaries. But when I heard the knock on the door and saw Sergio on the other side, all resolve evaporated. It was as if loneliness spoke louder than reason. The neediness accumulated over years without true love transformed each encounter into a vital necessity. And there was something even deeper. I felt shame. Shame at seeing myself in that role, at knowing I was accepting less than I deserved, at realizing that even as a mature man I still let myself be led by empty promises. At family dinners, when my nephews praised me as an example of a proper man, I swallowed hard, remembering that the night before, I had given myself to a man who would return home and sleep next to his wife. This contrast eroded my pride. I wondered, is this the only form of love life has in store for me? Will I grow old as a supporting character in someone else's life? These questions hammered at my head, but never found answers. One night after one of these encounters, Sergio uttered a phrase that resonated deeply. We were lying there, still panting, and he said matter-of-factly, "You know I'll never leave my family, right?" I froze. I already knew this, of course, but hearing it out loud was like being punched in the gut. I tried to hide it, smiled slightly, feigned indifference, but inside, something cracked. The harsh truth had been bluntly stated. I would never be more than a shadow. Have you ever experienced this? Hearing from someone exactly what you didn't want to believe? If so, leave a comment below. Shadow. Because living as a shadow is one of the highest prices anyone can pay. Even after that night, I couldn't pull away. With each new encounter, I told myself, this time will be the last. But there was always a next time. Sergio would appear with that charismatic demeanor, that guilty smile, and it would all start again. It was like an addiction. I knew I wasn't getting true love, but what little I had felt better than absolute emptiness. And that kept me trapped in a never-ending cycle. I wondered if, at some point, life would exact a heavy price for this choice. And deep down, I knew the answer was yes. The most disturbing thing was realizing how quickly time passed. Months turned into years, and I was still in the same position, a man respected in public but secretly nurturing an impossible relationship. With each birthday, with each new age mark on my face, I felt the weight of a life unlived. The loneliness remained, but now it was accompanied by the certainty that I was wasting my last years of vitality. This realization was devastating. It wasn't just the lack of love that hurt, it was the accumulated regret. How many of you have felt this? The pain of realizing that time has passed and perhaps it was too late to change. If you have, leave a comment. Time. Because time is the most relentless enemy of all. My body also began to show signs. Sleepless nights, anxiety attacks, chest pressure. The doctors talked about stress, about taking care of my age. But I knew there was more. The weight of leading a double life, keeping secrets, accepting scraps, was consuming my health. And yet, I continued. Because loneliness for me seemed an even greater punishment than the physical exhaustion. Perhaps this is the hardest part of this story, realizing that the human heart, when deprived of true love, clings even to relationships that hurt it. But life always finds a way to turn things around, and in my case, it happened when I least expected it. An unexpected event, a poorly timed phrase, a misplaced glance. Everything was about to expose the secret I'd kept for so many years. And this exposure would change not only my relationship with Sergio, but also the way I saw myself in the mirror. Because there comes a time when even the best-kept silence can't resist. The world always finds a way through. I believed I could keep everything under control. The routine of secret meetings, the ready-made excuses, the disguised silence amid family dinners. But it was only a matter of time before the cracks appeared. One night, after yet another date, I left my diary on the living room table, a simple notebook with a black cover but filled with intimate notes. Loose words, phrases I'd never had the courage to utter, outbursts I'd kept to myself. Sergio, curious, opened the pages without asking, and there he found something that disconcerted him. Confessions that went beyond the physical, revelations of a feeling he'd always pretended didn't exist. I had written, in firm letters, that I loved this man who only appeared when needed. Sergio slammed his notebook shut, as if betrayed by an expectation he'd never wanted to fulfill. With a cold look, he said, "I never promised love. If you're expecting that from me, you'll be disappointed." The sentence landed like a blow. I tried to argue, saying I wasn't demanding anything, that I just needed to write down what I felt. But the silence between us was heavier than any answer. From that day on, the atmosphere changed. Our encounters lost what little lightness they had, and I began to feel like I was walking on broken glass. Sergio seemed more distant, more impatient. There was no longer time for long conversations, nor for lingering glances. It was just the physical encounter, quick, as if he were fulfilling an obligation. I realized I had crossed an invisible line, that of desire turning into feeling, and that, for Sergio, was unacceptable. The hardest part was dealing with the absences. I'd go days without news, messages, or phone calls. When Sergio finally showed up, he always came with excuses. The family demands a lot. I can't arouse suspicion. You know how complicated it is. And I accepted it, even though I knew that, in practice, I wasn't a priority. I was the refuge, the escape, the hiding place. How many of you have experienced this? Have you ever felt like someone only comes when they need you, but you still open the door? If so, leave a comment below. Prison, because that's exactly how you feel. Trapped in a cycle that hurts, but at the same time, nourishes. Our encounters were always marked by contrasts, sometimes intense, bodies intertwined, gazes that seemed to break the silence of decades. Other times, cold, quick, almost mechanical. I never knew what to expect. And this unpredictability was addictive. I told myself I should cut ties, that I needed to set boundaries. But when I heard the knock on the door and saw Sergio on the other side, all resolve evaporated. It was as if loneliness spoke louder than reason. The neediness accumulated over years without true love transformed each encounter into a vital necessity. And there was something even deeper. I felt shame. Shame at seeing myself in that role, at knowing I was accepting less than I deserved, at realizing that, even as a mature man, I still let myself be led by empty promises. At family dinners, when my nephews praised me as an example of a proper man, I swallowed hard, remembering that the night before, I had given myself to a man who would return home and sleep next to his wife. This contrast eroded my pride. I wondered, is this the only form of love life has in store for me? Will I grow old as a supporting character in someone else's life? These questions hammered at my head, but never found answers. One night, after one of these encounters, Sergio uttered a phrase that resonated deeply. We were lying there, still panting, and he said matter-of-factly, "You know I'll never leave my family, right?" I froze. I already knew this, of course, but hearing it out loud was like being punched in the gut. I tried to hide it, smiled slightly, feigned indifference, but inside something cracked. The harsh truth had been bluntly stated. I would never be more than a shadow. Have you ever experienced this? Hearing from someone exactly what you didn't want to believe? If so, leave a comment below. Shadow. Because living as a shadow is one of the highest prices anyone can pay. Even after that night, I couldn't pull away. With each new encounter, I told myself, this time will be the last. But there was always a next time. Sergio would appear with that charismatic demeanor, that guilty smile, and it would all start again. It was like an addiction. I knew I wasn't getting true love, but what little I had felt better than absolute emptiness. And that kept me trapped in a never-ending cycle. I wondered if, at some point, life would exact a heavy price for this choice. And deep down, I knew the answer was yes. The most disturbing thing was realizing how quickly time passed. Months turned into years and I was still in the same position. A man respected in public but secretly nurturing an impossible relationship. With each birthday, with each new age mark on my face, I felt the weight of a life unlived. The loneliness remained, but now it was accompanied by the certainty that I was wasting my last years of vitality. This realization was devastating. It wasn't just the lack of love that hurt, it was the accumulated regret. How many of you have felt this? The pain of realizing that time has passed and perhaps it was too late to change? If you have, leave a comment. Time. Because time is the most relentless enemy of all. My body also began to show signs. Sleepless nights, anxiety attacks, chest pressure. The doctors talked about stress, about taking care of my age. But I knew there was more. The weight of leading a double life, keeping secrets, accepting scraps, was consuming my health. And yet, I continued. Because loneliness, for me, seemed an even greater punishment than the physical exhaustion. Perhaps this is the hardest part of this story, realizing that the human heart, when deprived of true love, clings even to relationships that hurt it. But life always finds a way to turn things around. And in my case, it happened when I least expected it. An unexpected event, a poorly timed phrase, a misplaced glance. Everything was about to expose the secret I'd kept for so many years. And this exposure would change not only my relationship with Sergio, but also the way I saw myself in the mirror. Because there comes a time when even the best-kept silence can't resist. The world always finds a way through. I believed I could keep everything under control. The routine of secret meetings, the ready-made excuses, the disguised silence amid family dinners. But it was only a matter of time before the cracks appeared. One night, after yet another date, I left my diary on the living room table. A simple notebook, with a black cover, but filled with intimate notes, loose words, phrases I'd never had the courage to utter, outbursts I'd kept to myself. Sergio, curious, opened the pages without asking, and there he found something that disconcerted him. Confessions that went beyond the physical, revelations of a feeling he'd always pretended didn't exist. I had written in firm letters that I loved this man who only appeared when needed. Sergio slammed his notebook shut, as if betrayed by an expectation he'd never wanted to fulfill. With a cold look, he said, I never promised love. If you're expecting that from me, you'll be disappointed. The sentence landed like a blow. I tried to argue, saying I wasn't demanding anything, that I just needed to write down what I felt. But the silence between us was heavier than any answer. From that day on, the atmosphere changed. Our encounters lost what little lightness they had, and I began to feel like I was walking on broken glass. Sergio seemed more distant, more impatient. There was no longer time for long conversations, nor for lingering glances. It was just the physical encounter, quick, as if he were fulfilling an obligation. I realized I had crossed an invisible line, that of desire turning into feeling, and that for Sergio was unacceptable. In an attempt to quell this emptiness, I began seeking distractions. I started working more on neighborhood volunteer projects, volunteered to help neighbors, and increased my gym time. But in every space I occupied, there was always an internal echo. My body moved, but my mind remained chained to memories. It was like trying to sweep the floor with the window open on a windy day. No matter how much I cleaned, the dirt returned. It was during this period of fragility that I began to realize something even more painful. Sergio had moved on. On one of his social media accounts, I happened to see a photo. Sergio was at a family barbecue, smiling, hugging his wife and children as if nothing had happened. It was like a knife stab, not only because of the stark contrast between the joy he displayed and the devastating silence I carried, but because it proved that, for him, everything was nothing more than a parenthesis, a disposable secret. I closed my phone screen in anger, but the image had already imprinted itself on me. That same night, sitting on the porch, I wondered if there was still a way out of this labyrinth. What suffocated me most wasn't missing Sergio, but the feeling of having lost myself in the process. I realized that over the years, I'd shaped my entire life around protecting a relationship that was never acknowledged. I lost friends, lost the chance to build my own story, even lost confidence in my ability to love. And here I want you to reflect with me. How many of you have felt this way, looking back and realizing you sacrificed too much for something that was never reciprocated? How many have given up their own identity, their own time, just to keep alive a bond that, deep down, only existed on one side? If this has happened to you, write the word in the comments. True, because it is the truth that no matter how painful it may be, always finds a way to emerge. Little by little, I began to notice signs that I couldn't continue this cycle. My body gave the first warnings: constant palpitations, anxiety attacks, sleepless nights that seemed endless. The doctor mentioned stress and recommended rest, but I knew it wasn't just that. It was the weight of silence taking its toll. Every hidden secret, every swallowed tear, every lie told. All of this was turning into illness. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I made a decision. I took out the diary I always kept, opened it to a blank page, and wrote, "I have to choose between surviving and hiding or living my truth." My hands trembled as I scribbled the words, but when I finished, I felt a strange lightness, as if a stone had been lifted from my chest. For the first time, I admitted to myself that I no longer wanted to pay the price of living a lie, but there was still one problem: courage. Because knowing what to do is one thing, having the courage to take the first step is another. I looked out the window, saw the reflection of my aging face in the glass, and asked myself, is there still time? This question resonated with me like a call, and perhaps it's the same question you've asked yourself. Is there still time to start over? If this question has crossed your mind, write the word "I" in the comments. Time. Because time, however cruel it may be, can still offer a second chance when we have the courage to seize it. In the days following that dawn, my life seemed to be moving in two directions at once. On one hand, my routine insisted on remaining the same: the solitary breakfast, the volunteer work that filled a few hours, the superficial encounters I accepted to avoid arousing suspicion. On the other, there was an internal turmoil that wouldn't leave me alone. Every time I passed in front of the mirror, the question returned: is there still time to live my truth? It was as if my own reflection demanded an answer I didn't have the courage to give. The nights continued to be a battlefield. Lying in bed, I closed my eyes but found no rest. Memories came like waves, bringing images from the past that I tried to push away, but which insisted on returning. The touch of Sergio's hand under the table, the stolen glances in meetings, the quick encounters in cheap motels that carried all the desire and shame of a lifetime. In these moments, the loneliness became unbearable. My body cried out for presence, but my mind reminded me that deep down, I had always been alone. One day, walking aimlessly through downtown, I found myself standing in front of a bookstore window. A prominent book seemed to scream at me, "The Courage to Be Who You Are." I stared at the cover for a few minutes, as if it were a challenge. I went in, bought the copy, and took it home. In the first few pages, I found a sentence that made me tremble. "The price of silence is always higher than the price of rejection." I immediately closed the book because it hurt, but the phrase kept resonating with me. And perhaps it's resonating with you, watching me now. How many times have you kept quiet for fear of rejection? How many times have you paid the price of silence just to avoid facing the gaze of others? If this has happened to you, write the word in the comments. Silence. In the days that followed, I began to change small habits. Instead of avoiding the past, I decided to confront it. I dug out old boxes of photographs, revisiting memories I'd always preferred to keep locked away. It was painful, but liberating. I realized I'd spent my life trying to hide, not just from others, but from myself, how much I needed affection. And as I leafed through those yellowed photos, I realized something cruel. There were almost no records of me with the people who truly mattered. There were family parties, work events, social gatherings, but almost no photos in which my eyes truly sparkled. This visual void was the reflection of an existential void. It was during this process that I began to open up, albeit shyly. In a conversation with a childhood friend, I blurted out, almost without realizing it, "Sometimes I regret hiding so much of my life." He looked at me silently, didn't ask any questions, and just said, "You still have time." That simple sentence was a spark. The confirmation that I could still start over didn't come from a book or a diary, but from the mouth of someone who's known me for decades. Even so, the fear remained overwhelming. I found myself rehearsing imaginary dialogues. I imagined telling my sister, my nephew, a close friend. With each rehearsal, I saw reactions: shock, anger, jokes, but also the possibility of understanding. This mental exercise exhausted me, but it was inevitable. The weight of a hidden life doesn't lift overnight. I knew I would need courage, and courage is built step by step, facing small fears until the biggest one can be faced. The turning point came when I received an unexpected message. It was from Sergio. Short, direct, almost cold. "I hope you are well." I stood paralyzed, staring at the screen. My hands were sweating, my heart was racing, my eyes filled with tears. Deleting the message would have been easy, but I couldn't. That simple sentence brought back the scarred wound, and at the same time, it sparked the realization that I could no longer remain trapped in that cycle. Sergio had already moved on. The problem was, I was still trapped. That night, in front of my diary, I wrote another sentence. I no longer want to be a prisoner of the story I refused to write out loud. I closed the notebook and felt a different energy, as if I was finally realizing what I needed to do. It wasn't just about Sergio. It wasn't just about the past. It was about I recover, about stopping running away. And here's the big question. How many of you have found yourself trapped in a story that no longer depended on others, but only on the courage to let go? How many know that what hinders freedom is not the judgment of others, but the fear of facing that judgment itself? If you've been through this, leave a comment with your thoughts. Courage, because it is she who transforms silence into life. Little by little, I began to see people differently. On the street, I saw couples holding hands, and instead of envy, I felt a desire to experience the same. While volunteering, I noticed discreet glances from a younger colleague, who perhaps saw something in me beyond the facade of a serious and reserved man. This frightened me, but also inspired me. Was there still room for a new beginning? Could my heart, even after decades of silence, still learn to beat for someone other than a ghost from the past? As these thoughts grew, so did the sense of urgency. I understood that I couldn't spend the rest of my life collecting ifs. The what if I had spoken up? What if I had come out? What if I had lived? These ghosts weighed more heavily than any rejection. So I made a silent but firm decision. Soon, I would take the first step towards revealing my truth. But before that, I needed to brace myself for the impact. I knew the revelation wouldn't come without consequences. Some friends would distance themselves. Family members might reject me. Prejudice on some level would be present. But there was also the chance, for the first time, to feel the freedom of no longer having to wear masks. And that prospect, while frightening, was too powerful to ignore. Perhaps you, who are listening to me now, are experiencing something similar. Perhaps you also carry a secret, a desire, a truth that has never been spoken aloud. Perhaps you fear the price it may cost. But remember, the price of silence will always be higher. If you believe this, write the word in the comments true, because the truth, when it arrives, changes everything. That weekend I left home determined to walk aimlessly. The streets were crowded, the sun illuminated the ancient facades, and with every face I passed, I wondered, is this person also hiding something? Is they also paying the price of silence? This thought comforted me. I wasn't alone. I never was. And this realization, though simple, gave me the strength to carry on. I realized that aimless walk through the crowd had ignited something inside me. I no longer wanted to just survive, I wanted to live, and it was in this state of unease that, as I turned a corner, my eyes met someone I hadn't seen in decades. The shock was immediate. My heart raced. My breath vanished. My legs seemed to give out. It was Mauricio, a former childhood friend, someone who knew part of my story but not all of it, someone who carried, even without knowing it, fragments of a secret so carefully guarded. The meeting was quick, almost run over by the rush of the city. "Marcelo, is that really you?" Mauricio asked in disbelief, as if seeing a ghost from the past. I tried to smile, to hide the tremor in my voice. "It's me, yes. It's been so long." We exchanged a few words, a handshake, and went our separate ways. But the impact remained. On the way home I felt my body vibrate, as if fate had just nudged me. You won't be able to hide forever. That night I couldn't sleep. Mauricio's image kept coming back to me like a nagging reminder. I wondered, did he still remember the looks that were never explained? Did he harbor suspicions about what really went on behind the scenes of our youth? What if he spoke? What if he exposed me? My mind was filled with unanswered questions. And maybe you felt this too. The fear that someone from your past will appear and reveal the truth you tried to hide. If you've experienced this, write the word in the comments. Past. The next day, a coincidence moved me even more. While volunteering, a new group of young people arrived for a fundraising campaign. Among them was a young man named Gabriel. He caught my attention, not because of his youth, nor his beauty, but because of his gaze. There was a disarming sincerity about him. During a break, we sat side by side, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. Gabriel told me he'd come out a few years ago, faced rejection from his family, but found strength in his own truth. I listened in silence, and each word pierced me like an arrow. It was as if someone were saying out loud everything I'd never had the courage to say. After that day, I began to look forward to the hours when Gabriel would be present. There was no desire, no passion. There was something even more powerful. Hope. Seeing someone so young speak their truth fearlessly showed me that perhaps it was still possible. But along with hope came the pain of comparison. While Gabriel lived openly with his identity, I still hid behind layers of silence. One rainy afternoon, Gabriel, without understanding the weight of what he was saying, said something that gave me goosebumps. "Lies age faster than we do." I froze. My face burned, as if I'd been unmasked without even knowing it. That sentence echoed for days. I looked in the mirror and asked myself, how many years have I lost because of the lie? How many moments have I not lived because I was afraid of being who I am? And fate, as if wanting to test my courage, brought another shock. I received invitation to a reunion of former college classmates. At first, I considered refusing. The fear of encountering faces from the past and facing uncomfortable questions seemed unbearable. But something inside me told me that perhaps it was time to return, that perhaps it was there, in that space full of memories, that I would find the missing piece. The room was brightly lit, filled with familiar voices, loud laughter, and repeated stories. I walked as if treading through a minefield. Each time-worn face reminded me of a version of myself that was never real. And it was then that the biggest surprise happened. Amidst the hubbub, a voice called my name firmly. I turned and froze. It was Sergio, the same Sergio who marked my youth, who was part of my secrets, who disappeared without explanation. My heart almost stopped. Sergio was different, of course. Wrinkles marred his face, his hair gray, but his eyes were the same. And when they met mine, there was no need for words. It was as if all the decades-long silence had been broken in that instant. The reunion was quick. A handshake, a restrained smile. Inside, I was crumbling. That night when I got home, I couldn't contain myself. I opened my diary and wrote, "He still exists. He's not just a memory. And now, what do I do?" The question kept resonating. And maybe you've experienced this too, meeting someone who made an impact on your life and realizing that the feelings never truly disappeared. If you've been through this, leave a comment with the word reunion. Following days were a whirlwind. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Sergio's face kept coming back, mixed with old memories, the hidden touch, the constant fear, the nights we almost had the courage and backed out at the last second. And now, decades later, there it was again, an open wound and an impossible possibility all at once. But there was something different. I was no longer the shy young man who was afraid of everything. I was an older man, yes, but also a man tired of hiding from me. Our reunion wasn't just an accident. It was a summons, a call from the past asking me to decide once and for all whether I would live the rest of my days in silence or have the courage to embrace who I am. The plot took on new weight. I was faced with the limit. Continue repeating a life of secrets or finally face the price of being free. I spent the next few days as if walking down a long corridor full of half-open doors. Through every crack, a piece of the past called my name. The image of Sergio at the alumni meeting wouldn't leave my mind. His gray hair, his defensive posture, his eyes that, for a few seconds, seemed to apologize for a lifetime. On the third day, the message finally arrived. "We need to talk. Cafe on Fig Street. Tomorrow 4 p.m. I read and reread, my stomach turning. Answering yes was like pulling a trigger. Rua das Figueiras smelled of recent rain. I arrived first, as always. I chose a table at the back, where I could see the door. When Sergio entered, there was no hug. There was a silent recognition between two men who know each other's ruins. He took off his coat, adjusted his glasses, and spoke first, bluntly. "I didn't come to ask for money." The sentence, instead of relieving, tightened. I nodded, silent. He continued. "I came to ask you not to tell anything. My family, you understand?" The waiter placed 2 cups on the table. Steam rose as a signal for departure. I breathed through my nose slowly. "Sergio, I haven't told you anything for 40 years, but I'm no longer the safe of your fear." The silence was heavy. Outside, a child dragged a colorful backpack. Inside, 2 men discussed the price of a lie. Sergio leaned in. "You're right, but now it's not just about me. My daughter has taken over the family business. Any scandal? Any rumor? She foots the bill." I closed my eyes for a moment. I remembered the rainy night I'd heard the cold sentence. "I can't lose my family for you." The argument was the same, only the labels had changed. "And what do I get?" I asked, surprising myself with a boldness I had never had before. Sergio bit his lip, an old gesture from when he had no answers. "Gain peace." Below, without humor. Peace? Peace was what I didn't have because I agreed to protect you. It hurt to say, but it hurt right. He lowered his eyes. "I was wrong, Poso, and I feel it." The 2 words floated, fragile. I wasn't sure if I believed them. I preferred to listen more. Then he placed a thin brown envelope on the table. This arrived at my office. No return address. Copies of old messages, motel reservations, a photo of us from that trip. Someone saved it all, and someone wants to use it now. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just fear. It was the feeling that the door between past and present had been broken down. "Who sent it?" he wanted to know. "I don't know, but I suspect." He looked around, lowered his tone. "Mauritius." The name ran through me like a cold current. The colleague I'd met on the street. The casual question. The quick handshake. Why? Debts, perhaps. Or old resentment. He worked with me for a while. Left badly. If he has something and decides to sell it to some journalist, or worse, come knocking on my door. I imagined blood-curdling headlines, the neighbor's eyes, my sister calling me on Sunday. I imagined Gabriel from volunteering, seeing my name in a WhatsApp group full of cheap jokes. My shame wasn't about being who I am. It was about having been kidnapped by secrecy. "I won't be your shield again, Sergio," I said firmly. "But I won't be your executioner either." He nodded silently. "So what do we do?" he insisted. I noticed the we, and it caused me a familiar unease. Since when would that story, told in the shadows, have a pronoun that fit in the bright light? Nothing to people. To answer, I'm going to do what I should have done years ago. Tell my story, on my terms, and not to destroy you, to free myself. Sergio's eyes widened, but he didn't respond. A part of him seemed to accept the sentence he'd always feared hearing deep down. The coffee ended without drama. As we said goodbye, he tried to hold my hand for a second longer. It was the gesture of someone apologizing without asking for it. I let him, but didn't reciprocate. I went out into the street and walked slowly. The sky was starting to get dark again. I grabbed my phone and wrote a short message to Gabriel. Would you like coffee tomorrow? I need a clean ear. He responded with an okay emoji and a time. Simple, direct, clean, exactly as I'd described. The next morning, we sat in a small cafe, far from the center. Gabriel ordered a toasted sandwich. I stuck with black coffee. I recounted everything in chunks. The beginning, the contract, the dependence, the blackmail that now loomed large. I didn't romanticize it. I didn't play the victim either. Gabriel listened without interrupting. Sometimes he frowned. Sometimes he pursed his lips. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, You don't have to prove anything to anyone, but there's one thing you can't outsource, choosing which side to take when fear strikes. I remained silent, chewing over the sentence. And more, he continued, if this Mauricio guy has material, the best way to take away his power is to tell you first. When we get ahead of ourselves, the blackmail turns to dust. I felt a shiver of courage, the kind you recognize as true before you even know how to explain it. I thought about recording a video, I confessed. No melodrama, no names, just my story, my voice, no apologies. Gabriel nodded in approval. What if they come to attack you? He asked. I breathed. I've learned that those who live to please invisible jurors die without applause or acquittal. I no longer want a courtroom. I want a road. The waiter brought the bill. Gabriel tried to pay. I insisted. A small but symbolic gesture. I wanted to finally bankroll my narrative. In the afternoon, I took the black-covered notebook out of the drawer. I remembered what I had written months ago. I have to choose between surviving in hiding or living my truth. Below, I added, today. I set up my phone on a simple tripod, tested the angle, the light. Were my hands shaking? They were. Would my voice falter? Maybe. But there was something new in my gaze. Firmness without anger. I pressed the rec. My name is Marcelo. I'm 65 years old. I was a good employee, a good uncle, a good neighbor, and I was a terrible guardian of myself. For decades, I accepted contracts of silence to fit into other people's worlds. Today, I return this world to whoever wants to stay in it. I choose to live in mine. I stopped, took a breath, continued. I didn't mention Sergio, nor any dates. I didn't betray anyone. I betrayed myself. I spoke of fear, guilt, health taking its toll. The day I understood that lies age faster than we do. I spoke about the rights of a 65-year-old man walk hand in hand without looking down. I was going to end there, but I didn't. If you who are listening know what I'm talking about, comment with the word truth. I'll read it, and I'll respond. Before publishing, I hesitated. I thought about my sister, my nephew, my old colleagues. I thought about Mauricio. I thought about the neighbors who turn hallways into courtrooms. And then I thought of something simple, my life. I pressed post. The first few hours were as silent as a funeral, the occasional viewing, 3 comments from strangers, courage, strength, Marcelo, thank you for speaking up. Then, the flood came. Stories of men in their 40s, 50s, 70s, married, divorced, widowed, all coming out of similar holes of silence. Me too. I went through that. I never told anyone. I kept my promise. I responded one by one with a sentence, a thank you, a hug and words. In the middle of the messages, a photo, Mauricio, with a fake profile wrote, nice. Now don't forget to say who you learned it from. The poison tried to enter. Did not enter. I didn't answer. I kept the message as proof. That night, the phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I did. Marcelo, this is Anna. Respectful silence. It took me a while to put the pieces together. Sergio's wife. My heart forgot the step. I saw your video, she said without joking, without accusation. I recognized part of the story. Not all of it, but enough. I leaned against the wall. I'm not going to yell at you. I didn't call to make a scene. I called to tell you that if my husband comes to you, he's not speaking on our behalf. He's speaking on behalf of his fear. And that, the voice faltered, but continued. One day I also lived my life to fit in someone's drawer. My whole body shivered. Thank you for speaking with dignity, she concluded, and for not saying names. I know what you spared. The call ended with a civilized, almost tender, good night, one of those rare humanities. I hung up and I cried. Not of guilt, not of shame. I cried for all the planets forced to orbit that secret. For me, for Anna, for the daughter who never asked to inherit a scandal. I cried because, for the first time, I felt that the truth could hurt less than a lie. The next day, a short message from Sergio. We can talk? I stared at my phone for several long seconds. Yes, we could, but now on other land with other rules. Before responding, another notification. An email from an anonymous address. Subject, you didn't tell everything. In the body, an old photo of us. The same one from the trip, with a jagged edge where in the background a face mirrored in the window appeared. Mauricio. The caption, dry. Either you buy my silence, or I sell your story. I closed the notebook and smile. A short, almost imperceptible smile. Smile of someone who finally understood the game. I already had taken away the enemy's ammunition. What remained was to choose how to face the last attack, and with whom. If this were happening to you, would you face the blackmailer, or negotiate to protect the one you love? Comment, I face it, or I negotiate, and tell me why. Your comment can decide the next step in this story. Because now, my friend, the past no longer rules. What rules is the courage we choose to practice. I returned home with my head spinning. The reunion with Sergio had already been a shock, but now what was emerging was even more dangerous. Someone was willing to expose the life I had kept hidden for decades. It was as if every secret written in the diary had grown legs and was ready to run around the world. Mauricio's name came back to me like a nagging ghost. I wasn't entirely sure, but everything pointed to him, and it made me feel like the ground was opening up beneath my feet. In the days that followed, I couldn't think of anything else. My phone vibrated and I was terrified, imagining a new threat. The fear of being unmasked accompanied my every move, at the supermarket, in the elevator, in a conversation with the concierge. But what weighed most heavily was the knowledge that it wasn't just my life at stake. Sergio had a family, and now this secret could drag other people along. And then the unexpected happened again. Anna called me. The mere mention of who she was chilled me. For decades, I'd reduced her to a distant face in family photos. Now she was there on the other end of the line. Marcelo, I saw the video you posted. The voice held neither anger nor accusation, had the weight of someone who also lived in silence. I'm not going to argue. I just want you to know, if my husband tries to drag you into his fear, it's not on my behalf. I've never asked anyone to live in hiding. I leaned against the wall, unable to answer immediately. She took a deep breath and continued. I recognize part of the story you told. Not all of it, but enough to understand that you suffered too. And I respect the way you spoke. You didn't name names. You didn't expose me. You didn't expose my daughter. You were more careful with my family than he was. I remained silent, and for the first time in a long time, whole. Anna's words cut me in a different way. They weren't an accusation. They were an acknowledgement. And that hurt more than any attack, because it showed how even she, who should have been merely the victim of betrayal, was also trapped in a life of appearances. I realized that the decades-long silence hadn't just suffocated me, but her as well. Anna didn't call to humiliate me, but to thank me for speaking up with dignity. Before hanging up, she said something that has never left my memory. I also lived for many years in a drawer. I know the price of that, and in a way, I understand you. I hung up the phone and cried. They weren't tears of guilt. They were tears of humanity. For the first time, I saw Anna not as Sergio's wife, but as a woman who was also a prisoner of the same cruel rules that imprisoned me. I cried for her, for myself, for everyone orbiting that lie. But there was no time to get lost in my emotions. Shortly after the call, a new email arrived. The anonymous sender left no doubt. Outright blackmail. The photo showed me and Sergio, years ago. Nothing explicit, but enough to spark gossip and judgment if it fell into the wrong hands. The caption, short and blunt. Either you pay, or I sell the story. I took a deep breath. This time I didn't panic. The video I'd posted had already opened the door the blackmailer wanted to use. The difference was that now the narrative was in my hands, not those of the threatening party. Still, the risk was real, because the blackmail wasn't just about me, it was about everyone around me. I decided not to face it alone. I sought out Gabriel, the young man from the volunteer program, who had been a model of courage for me, and told him everything. I showed him the email, explained about Mauricio, and confessed my fear of things getting out of control. Gabriel listened in silence and, after a few minutes, responded firmly. If he has something against you, the best way to take away his power is to not give him the privilege of telling you first. You already did that when you posted the video. He can try, but he no longer has the weapon he thinks he does. The words rekindled something in me. For the first time, I felt like I might no longer be a prisoner of that threat. My whole life I'd lived in fear of judgment. Now I understood that strength lay in being proactive. It wasn't about beating Mauricio, nor about getting revenge on Sergio. It was about finally choose my story. And I ask you, if you were in my place, how would you react? You would face the blackmailer or would negotiate to avoid pain for the families of all involved? Write in the comments, I face it, or I negotiate. Your opinion can shed light on the next steps in this story. I reread the email and felt something shift inside me. For years, any threat would paralyze me. Now, I wanted to take a step forward, not back. Instead of deleting the message, I created a folder and saved everything with date and a short note, blackmail attempt. Then I wrote to Sergio directly and respectfully. I said that I wouldn't negotiate out of fear, and that if anyone tried to use the past to hurt us, I would tell the truth one more time. No names, no show, with the same firmness as the video. Sergio took a while to respond. When he did, it was short and distressed. He wanted to meet me. He said he needed to explain things he'd never said. I took a breath, thought of Anna and their daughter, and replied that we'd talk, at the right time, calmly and clearly, in a public place, without haste and without guilt. Next, I called Gabriel. I told him the blackmail had come back through the back door and that I didn't want to turn my life into a ring. He listened and proposed a simple solution. First, do not act alone. Second, document everything. Third, warn anyone who might be grazed by a bullet so that no move would appear to be treason. I agreed. I awed Anatha's care. I picked up the phone, excused myself, and called her. I spoke slowly, explaining about the email, about the suspicions regarding Mauricio, and about the fact that I didn't intend to expose any family. Anna was silent for a while and then responded in a way that surprised me. If there was a meeting with the potential blackmailer, she wanted to stay close by, at a distance, to see it with her own eyes. He said it wasn't to protect Sergio, but to protect his daughter and his own story, which for a long time had been told by other people. I accepted on one condition: no drama, no attack, just facts. We agreed on a simple place, a neighborhood bakery, people coming and going, low music, the smell of brewed coffee. Gabriel would sit at a table in the back, pretending to read a book. Anna would be on the corner with a partial view of the hall. If Mauricio showed up, there would be no ambush, just talk. I would arrive with an empty envelope and a paper prepared by Gabriel, a short statement stating that any undue dissemination of images without authorization characterizes crime and would be taken to the authorities. It was not a threat. It was the limit. On the appointed day, I arrived a few minutes early and recognized in my own steps a calm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't bravado. It was the serenity that arises when we decide that we'll not sell his own life at a fair price. I sat down, ordered a black coffee, and watched ordinary people with their little emergencies. Time stretched out until Mauricio came in. He didn't have the smile of an old colleague. He had the look of someone who measures the other person to find their weakness. He sat down without invitation and spoke first, with an irony that belied the time of day. He said he had valuable memories, that people's curiosity pays well, and that it was best not to waste anyone's time. I let him talk. When he finally stopped, I put it on the table, the empty envelope and the statement. I explained in a firm voice that I had nothing to hide about my life, that I had already told apart from the fact that it fit me without mistreating anyone, and that any attempt to sell material to harm third parties would be recorded, reported, and combated. There was no scream. There was clarity. Mauricio tried to laugh, but his laughter was short-lived. He didn't expect to find a Marcelo who doesn't apologize for existing. The conversation went on for long minutes. He oscillated between cynicism and attack. He said the city loved a scandal, that old friends would remember details, that journalists were always chasing clicks. I responded with something that silenced the table. What gets clicks dies quickly. What is born of truth remains standing. And if I wanted to destroy someone, I would have done this when I was young and fragile. At that time I kept quiet out of fear. Now I speak by choice. There is a huge difference between these two moments, and it is this difference that takes away the power of blackmail. At that point, something in Mauricio's face changed. The mask slipped for a second. He revealed almost without realizing it that he was in debt. He said he'd tried to talk to Sergio and was ignored. He said he'd considered selling the story out of anger, not just for money. I listened and saw a man trapped by his own life. Empathy doesn't negate responsibility, but it changes the tone. Instead of humiliating, I proposed a possible way out. I said I wouldn't pay a cent for silence. I said I wouldn't be complicit in cover-up. However, I also said I was willing to write a public account without names, emphasizing the importance of seeking help when life gets tough, and that I would narrate my own process of liberation, including the setbacks. I told him that, if he wanted, he could seek help from a public lawyer, a social service, a support network. It was an invitation to leave the shortcut of scandal and enter the difficult path of resolution. Mauricio was torn. He realized the bait hadn't caught my attention. He tried one last move. He took out his phone and showed an enlarged photo on the screen. It was the same old image from that trip. There was a shadow reflected in the glass, which he said was proof we weren't alone, that someone could always confirm the story. I looked at the photo with a different perspective. It wasn't a threat. It was a record of a time gone by. And records, when viewed with respect, aren't ammunition. They're memories. I thanked him, stood up, and concluded the conversation with the phrase that would become a landmark. From then on, no one would sell pieces of my life anymore. I had bought my freedom back myself, with courage. When I left, I saw Gabriel in the distance. He gave a discreet nod of approval. Across the street, Anna stood motionless, looking at me as if she'd sensed something essential. I walked over to her. We didn't have much reason to hug, but we looked at each other like people who'd weathered the same storm, each in their own way. She asked if everything was okay. I told her it was better than before because now everything had a name and a limit. I also said I didn't intend to expose Sergio, that the past between us would be over without a show. She thanked me, and before we said goodbye, proposed something unexpected. She suggested I talk to her daughter, an adult, prepared, aware, not to apologize but to prevent others from spreading gossip where the family deserved only transparency. I promised to think about it. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was a fair one. That same night, Sergio sent another message. He said he knew about the meeting and that Mauricio wouldn't give up. He also said he was scared, but willing to accept whatever came, as long as his daughter was protected. I replied that there was a more honest path than chasing shadows. I proposed 3 steps. First, file a report against blackmail, with the emails and messages saved. Second, arrange a frank conversation with Anna with her daughter, short and objective, without intimate details, just enough to protect the family from rumors. Third, I would publish a second video, calm and mature, stating that I would not give in to threats, that my story had already been told, and that any further attempts to use my name to harm people would be dealt with in court. Sergio asked for time to think. I gave him time. In the following days, something curious happened. My first video continued to grow, but in a different way. It wasn't simply viewership, it was testimonials, coming from all walks of life. Men and women recounting losses, lessons learned, invisible contracts they once signed without realizing it, and the courage to break those contracts. Older people were grateful to hear someone from their generation say, in no uncertain terms, that it's still possible to start over. Younger people commented that they wanted to grow old without carrying lies. I responded as best I could, always gently and firmly. I said I wasn't a hero, that I was just tired of living in fear, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to navigate it with a sense of the future. The morning I decided to record the second video, I received another anonymous message. It wasn't from Mauricio. It was someone introducing themselves as a reporter. They said they'd received material and were asking for an interview. My heart raced for a moment, but my head remained level. Instead of accepting or denying it, I replied that I would only speak in writing and that would not deal with third parties. I offered excerpts from the first video and a short text about dignity and aging truthfully. The reporter insisted on details. I repeated the limit. If the article were to be published, it would be without spectacle, without malicious adjectives, without turning other people's lives into a circus. I knew I couldn't control everything, but I could. My gesture. That same day, Gabriel came to my apartment to help with the recording. We set up the phone, checked the sound, and agreed on the tone. I didn't want to justify past choices. I wanted to illuminate present paths. I began by saying that I wouldn't back down in the face of pressure, that I wasn't going to buy silence, and that I wasn't going to sell anyone. I spoke of respect. I spoke of the importance of name the fear so that it diminishes. I spoke of the responsibility of every adult to protect those who have nothing to do with history. I spoke of freedom as daily exercise, not as a one-day explosion. And in a passage that would leave any blackmailer breathless, I said that everything they needed to know about me was already in the previous video and in the answers I had been giving. Other than that, what existed was life moving forward. When we finished, Gabriel suggested one final precaution, that I warn Anna before posting, so she wouldn't be surprised by comments. I called. I told her the content. She listened and, with a calm that seemed new, said she was with her daughter at that moment, that they had just spoken. He said there were tears, yes, but also respect. He said his daughter preferred. The hard truth has cowardly gossip. Hearing this, I felt an old weight dissolve. That family no longer needed to fear the hallway, the corner, the message that crossed. We were naming things, and when things are given a name, they lose their monster-like size. The video went live late in the afternoon. In the first few hours, the reaction was muted. Then came a wave of support very similar to the first. Only more aware older men wrote saying they wanted to talk to their children. Women were grateful to see a man admitting his weaknesses without hiding behind an iron mask. Some criticized, of course. They said it was an exaggeration, that the past should stay in the past. I responded to them all with the same phrase. The past only rests when the present finds a worthy way to carry it. The following night, the news no one expected arrived. Mauricio sent me a short message, saying he wanted to talk again but somewhere else. The bakery was too crowded. He suggested an empty parking lot. I immediately declined. I said I would only meet in public places, or in writing. Mauricio hesitated and suggested a local bookstore. I accepted, but set clear conditions. I would go with a friend. No money would be exchanged. Any attempt at hidden recording by Mauricio would end the conversation. The objective was a simple agreement. He would stop the threats and seek a legal solution to his problems. The rest would be resolved in time. When I arrived at the bookstore, I smelled paper and coffee, and the atmosphere helped keep me grounded. Gabriel stood in the romance section, attentively leafing through a random book. Mauricio arrived with an envelope. He said he'd given up on selling the story. He also said he'd already passed some of the material to someone who wanted to watch the world burn. This someone, he said, wasn't a journalist or an old colleague. He was an anonymous person with social media accounts, specialized in spreading rumors to gain followers. A one-time arsonist. I understood immediately what this meant. The threat had come from the hands of a man with a face and a past, and entered a faceless chain of messages driven by likes. It was another kind of danger, more diffuse, more rapid. The envelope Mauricio carried contained copies that were no longer worth as much, and a note with the name of the arsonist's profile. I took the paper, thanked him for his belated honesty, and ended the conversation. I promised nothing in return. I left the bookstore with Gabriel and called Anna. I told her the news in no uncertain terms. We said that if the material appeared in any gossip magazine, we would be ready, together. We also said we wouldn't let our daughter find out through a stranger's timeline. Better to find out at home than in the virtual hallway. It was a pact between adults, no heroics, just responsibility. At home, I sat on the porch, looked out over the city, and sensed something great was yet to come. I had learned that when life decides to turn the page, the paper can tear if the hand shakes. So I took a breath, memorized the arsonist's name, and wrote in my notebook the phrase that would guide whatever came next. No one decides for me which story tells who I am. I decide, I tell, I sustain. Now tell me, you who have followed this far, in your opinion, should I publicly expose the profile that received the material and warn them that I will take legal action? Or should I ignore the arsonist and continue talking only about myself without giving a platform to those who live on rumors? Comment. I expose for justice, or I ignore and follow. If you want, also leave a password so I know you're with me until the end. It can be courage true, without fear, or I face. Your feedback will guide the final chapter of this journey. I stood still before the reflection of the laptop's blank screen, as if the very darkness of the glass forced me to look within. The encounter with Mauricio, Anna's call, the veiled threats, and Gabriel's courage had become a single, tight, and resilient thread, pulling me toward an inevitable choice. My heart was beating fast, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was a mixture of fear and freedom, a kind of adrenaline rush we feel when we realize there's no turning back. The video I'd already recorded was a spark, but now the flame needed to grow, not to ignite, but to illuminate. I knew the next step would define how I would live the rest of my days, in the prison of blackmail, or on the still uncertain terrain of freedom. That morning the city slept, but I remained awake. I picked up the black-covered diary again and wrote in large letters, I owe nothing to anyone but myself. The sentence seemed simple, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. I remembered every invisible contract I'd signed in silence, every door I'd closed, every excuse I'd made to avoid detection. And I realized that all of this only fueled the power of those who thrive on controlling others' fears. That's what the blackmailer didn't understand. Fear only exists as long as we feed it. When we decide to look it in the eye, it shrinks. That was exactly what I wanted to show everyone watching my story. That courage isn't a gift, but a decision born when patience with silence runs out. The next day, I called Gabriel. I said I wanted to record one last video, longer, more profound, one that wouldn't just be a rant but an open letter to all the men of my generation. I wanted to talk about the price of silence, the lies that age us faster than we do, the loneliness that destroys us from within. Gabriel listened in silence and then replied, If you speak truthfully without fear, this video won't be just yours. It will belong to thousands of men who experience the same thing and have never had the courage to put it into words. That phrase was like a password. I understood that, this time, I wasn't speaking just for myself. I was speaking for everyone still trapped in the invisible contract I'd carried for decades. I set up the room simply. A table, a chair, the diary beside me, the cell phone camera on a tripod. No sets, no rehearsals. When I started recording, my voice came out firm but emotional. My name is Marcelo, I'm 65 years old, and I lead a life that didn't fit the mold the world offered me. I spent decades being the man they expected of me. Hardworking, serious, discreet, trustworthy. But inside me was someone who never had the right to live out loud. That someone was myself. I paused, took a deep breath and continued. I've lived forbidden loves. I've lived hidden encounters. I've lived contracts of silence that gave me pleasure for hours and guilt for years. I lived as a shadow, and today I say, no shadow deserves more attention than life itself. The words came out as if my entire body were writing. I spoke of Sergio, not by name, but as the married man who sought me out, caught between guilt and need. I spoke of Mauricio, not as an enemy, but as a symbol of a system that turned secrets into currency. I spoke of Anna, the woman who never asked to be a character, but who also lived imprisoned by the same silence. And above all, I spoke of myself, of how fear prevented me from experiencing clear loves, of how the wrinkles on my face are not just from age, but from the weight of omission. I didn't cry, I didn't apologize, I didn't justify myself, I simply told. And in telling, I freed myself. With each sentence I imagined older men alone, watching from the other side of the screen, perhaps with tears in their eyes, perhaps in silence, perhaps angry with themselves. I knew some would reject, mock, turn away, but I also knew others would see themselves in me, and it was for these people that I spoke. I'm not a hero. I'm not a martyr, I said. I'm just a man tired of living in fear. And if you who are listening to me feel that way, know that there is still time. There is still time to speak. There is still time to live. There is still time to choose the truth. The camera recorded not just a testimony, but a summons. Not a summons to leave in a hurry, but to begin to realize that silence is not destiny. It is merely a prison with the door ajar. When I finished, I turned off my phone and sat in silence for a few minutes. My heart raced, but this time there was no guilt. There was lightness. There was space. It was as if I had finally released the weight I'd carried for decades. Gabriel, who had been sitting in the corner of the room, stood up and said, "You have no idea what you just did. This isn't a video. It's an inheritance. It's a key that will open doors for many people." I smiled. Not a wide smile, but a serene one, of someone who knows life has finally taken a different turn. That night before bed, I received a flood of messages. Some were immediate support, others from people who had never commented on any video before. Men told stories of secret encounters. Women said they'd lived through marriages with husbands who carried secrets. Young people thanking me for seeing that, at 65, there's still a chance to start over. I responded as promised, one by one, patiently, with simple but firm words. And it was in that exchange that I realized the story was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who had the courage to write truth in the comments. And here, I want you, who made it to the end of this video, to be part of this story too. If you identified with any part, if at any point you felt I spoke for you, write the word in the comments, courage. If you believe that silence costs more than the truth, write true. And if you simply want to show that you are not alone, write I am here, because each comment isn't just a record. It's an act of resistance against the invisible contract that has so often imprisoned entire lives. And if this video resonated with you, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and share it, because my story could be the story of many, and the more people who listen, the more doors of silence will open.